Marcus Hayes had perfected the art of disappearing in plain sight. 3 months of living across the hall from Lena Morrison, and he'd mapped every exit, timed every departure, memorized the rhythm of her footsteps through the threadbare carpet of their Denver apartment building. He took the stairs when she waited for the elevator. He left for his shift at 4:30 in the morning, long before her light clicked on. He came home after midnight, when her door stayed dark and silent. It worked until the Tuesday evening she planted herself directly in his path. The hallway stretched narrow between them, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Marcus had his keys out, ready for the quick slide into his apartment, the familiar click of the deadbolt, the safety of walls between them. But Lena stood 3 feet from his door, arms crossed, dark hair falling past her shoulders, brown eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that made his chest constrict. Her voice came out steady, controlled. "Why do you keep avoiding me?" Marcus stopped. His jaw tightened. The keys bit into his palm. For a long moment he said nothing. The building's heating system clanked through the walls. Someone's television murmured 2 floors down. His heart hammered against his ribs, each beat a reminder of the night 2 years ago, when he'd felt someone else's heart stutter and fail beneath his hands. The words came out quiet, rough. "Because looking at you hurts." Lena stood frozen. Marcus turned away before he could see her face crumble, before the tears started, before he had to acknowledge what he'd just done. His key slid into the lock. The deadbolt clicked. The door swung open, and he stepped through, closing it behind him with a control that took every ounce of discipline 8 years as an EMT had taught him. He pressed his back against the door and listened to the silence on the other side. No footsteps retreating. No sound at all, just the weight of her standing there, trying to make sense of 5 words that had ripped open everything he'd spent 3 months trying to bury. Inside the apartment, the familiar disorder greeted him. Elijah's backpack dumped by the couch, homework scattered across the coffee table, the smell of frozen pizza lingering from dinner. Marcus pressed his palms against his eyes and tried to slow his breathing. "Dad?" He looked up. Elijah stood in the hallway leading to the bedrooms, 8 years old and wearing Spider-Man pajamas 2 sizes too big, hand-me-downs from Marcus's younger brother in Phoenix. The boy held a half-eaten apple, his mother's gentle eyes studying Marcus's face with the kind of scrutiny that made lying impossible. Marcus forced his voice steady. "Hey, buddy. What are you doing up?" "I heard the door." Elijah took another bite of his apple. "Are you okay? You look weird." Kids had no filter, which meant they were almost always honest. Marcus crossed the room and crouched to Elijah's level, smoothing a hand over the boy's tight curls, the texture so different from his own that it always reminded him of Emily, of the 6 years since she died and left him to figure out fatherhood alone. "I'm fine. Just tired. Long shift." Elijah studied his face with an intensity that made Marcus uncomfortable. The boy was too perceptive for his own good, had been since Emily's final month, when he'd watched his mother fade and learned that adults lied to protect children from truths they couldn't fix. "Did something happen with the nice lady?" Marcus's stomach dropped. "What nice lady?" "The one across the hall. Miss Lena." Elijah shrugged, unconcerned. "She always smiles at me in the elevator. You never smile back at her. It's kind of rude, Dad." His son had noticed. Of course, his son had noticed. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of every evasion, every time he'd pretended not to see Lena in the hallway, every moment he'd taught Elijah through example that running from difficult things was acceptable. "It's complicated, buddy." "That's what you always say when you don't want to explain something." Marcus almost smiled. "Because some things are hard to explain." Elijah considered this, chewing thoughtfully. Then he held out his apple. Want a bite? Despite everything, despite the woman probably still standing in the hallway outside, despite the memories clawing their way up his throat, Marcus smiled. He took the apple and bit into it, the sweetness cutting through the bitterness coating his mouth. Thanks, kid. Now go to bed. School tomorrow. Elijah nodded and padded back toward his room. At the doorway, he turned around. Dad, you always told me that when something's hard, you should talk about it, instead of keeping it inside. Maybe you should talk to Miss Lena. She seems nice. Before Marcus could respond, the boy disappeared into his room. Marcus sat down heavily on the couch, still holding the apple, and stared at the wall he shared with Lena's apartment. His son was right. He knew his son was right. But knowing something and doing something about it were two very different things. The first time Marcus had seen Lena Morrison, she'd been carrying boxes up the stairs. 3 months ago, mid-October, leaves turning gold outside and the Denver autumn crisp enough to see your breath. He'd been coming home from a double shift, exhausted, thinking about nothing except sleep. She'd been struggling with a box marked kitchen, trying to maneuver it through the doorway of the apartment that had sat empty for 2 months. He'd moved to help automatically. Years of emergency response had trained his body to react before his mind caught up. His hands had reached for the box. His mouth had opened to offer assistance. Then she'd turned her head, and the world had tilted sideways. Dark hair, brown eyes, the way she tilted her head when she listened, a small gesture he'd seen before in the crushed interior of a Honda Civic on a rainy October night 2 years earlier. The same bone structure, the same mouth, the same everything that had haunted his dreams for 24 months. Marcus had frozen. The box had slipped from Lena's grip, crashing to the floor with the sound of breaking ceramic. She'd gasped, dropping to her knees. "I'm so sorry. I've got it. I'm fine." He'd backed away without a word, into his apartment, door clicking shut behind him. His hands had been shaking. His heart had been racing. And in his mind, he'd been back in that crushed car, rain pouring through shattered windows, holding a woman's hand while she bled internally and talked about her little sister who was graduating college that spring. For 3 months, he'd been running from the ghost living across the hall. The next morning, Marcus left for his shift at 4:30, sneaking out through the building's back entrance near the service elevator. The route took him past the waste disposal area where the smell of rotting food hung thick and permanent. But it meant avoiding the main hallway, avoiding the chance of running into Lena. Elijah had complained earlier that week. "Dad, why are we leaving so early? The sun isn't even all the way up yet." Marcus had adjusted the boy's backpack straps and guided him toward the back exit. "Just trying something new, buddy. Change of scenery." "But this way smells like garbage." He wasn't wrong. The service corridor ran past the building's dumpsters, and the scent of yesterday's meals mixed with the sharp tang of recycling bins overflowing with empty containers. Marcus had wrinkled his nose, but kept walking. Sometimes the scenic route isn't the prettiest one. Elijah had given him a look that suggested he wasn't buying it, but he'd followed anyway, the way he always did, trusting his father even when his father's decisions made no sense. At Denver Fire Department Station 14, Marcus threw himself into the routine that had sustained him for 8 years. Check the ambulance, restock supplies, review shift assignments with his partner, Dwight Morrison, a veteran EMT with 20 years under his belt and a patience that bordered on supernatural. The morning passed in the familiar rhythm of emergency response. A cardiac event at a downtown office building, a diabetic crisis in Capitol Hill, a construction accident near Union Station. Each call demanded focus, precision, the ability to make split-second decisions while someone's life hung in the balance. Marcus was good at his job. He'd saved 47 people in 8 years. He had commendations, thank you letters, a reputation as one of the most reliable EMTs in the department. When he showed up to a scene, people lived, except when they didn't. By noon, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving Marcus sitting in the station break room with cold coffee and the weight of exhaustion pressing down on his shoulders. Dwight found him there, staring at nothing, lost in the space between wakefulness and the nightmares that waited whenever he closed his eyes. Dwight sat down across from him, his large frame making the plastic chair creak in protest. "All right, Thompson, spill it." Marcus looked up. "Spill what?" "Whatever's eating you alive." Dwight's voice was gentle, despite the directness of his words. "You've been wound tighter than a spring all week, and you keep checking your phone like you're waiting for bad news." Marcus shook his head. "It's nothing. Personal stuff." "Personal stuff is exactly the kind of stuff that gets people killed in this job." Dwight leaned forward. "You lose focus out there. You make mistakes. You make mistakes, people die." "Talk to me, man. That's what partners are for." For a moment, Marcus considered telling him everything. About the woman who'd moved in across the hall. About the way she looked exactly like someone he hadn't been able to save. About the guilt that woke him up at 3 in the morning, soaked in sweat, reliving those 11 minutes in the rain. But the words stuck in his throat the same way they always did when this subject came up. "I appreciate it, Dwight. I really do. But this is something I need to figure out on my own." Dwight studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but my door's open. Whenever you're ready." That evening, Marcus came home to find an envelope taped to his door. No name on the front, no return address. Just a plain white envelope with a slight bulge in the middle, the kind of thing that could be junk mail or something that changed everything. He stood in the hallway for a long moment, weighing his options. He could throw it away. He could pretend he'd never seen it. He could continue running the way he'd been running for 3 months, for 2 years, for as long as it took until the memories stopped clawing at his mind. Instead, he tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded around a small photograph. The photo showed 2 young women at a graduation ceremony, both smiling, both wearing matching silver necklaces. One of them was younger, brighter, hope written across her entire face in the way only 22-year-olds fresh out of college could manage. The other was the woman who died in his arms 2 years ago. Marcus recognized her instantly. Rachel Morrison. The dark hair, the warm eyes, the gentle smile that had flickered in and out of consciousness while he'd held her hand in that crushed car, rain pouring through the shattered windshield, sirens wailing in the distance, firefighters working with the jaws of life to cut through metal that had folded around her like a coffin. He unfolded the paper. The handwriting was neat, careful, like someone had taken time choosing each word. "I didn't come here by accident. I've been looking for you for 2 years. Not to blame you, not to demand answers. I just wanted to meet the person who was with my sister at the end. I want to know what she said. I want to know if she was scared. I want to know if she knew she was loved. Please, I need to know. And I think maybe you need to tell someone. Mina." Marcus read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully, slipped it back into the envelope, and sat down on the floor of the hallway, his back against his apartment door. The building settled around him. Water ran through pipes somewhere above. A door closed on a lower floor. The elevator hummed to life, carrying someone up or down, moving through the vertical geography of other people's lives, while Marcus sat perfectly still and tried to remember how to breathe. She'd been looking for him for 2 years. The accident report would have listed his name. EMT. Marcus Hayes, Denver Fire Department, first on scene. The hospital records would have confirmed he'd been there, that he'd held Rachel's hand, that he'd tried. But finding him would have taken effort. EMTs moved between departments, between cities, between lives that rarely intersected with the people they saved or failed to save. Lena had found him anyway, had tracked him down, discovered where he lived, rented the apartment across the hall, had spent 3 months watching him avoid her, waiting for him to acknowledge what she must have known from the first moment she'd seen his face in the hallway. He was the last person her sister had seen before dying. When Elijah found him later, Marcus was still sitting on the hallway floor, the photograph in his hands. The boy didn't ask questions. He just climbed down and leaned against his father's shoulder, the weight of him small and solid and real. "Is that the lady from across the hall?" Marcus nodded slowly. "And her sister?" "Yeah. She looks nice too." She was. Marcus's voice cracked on the words. She was very nice. Elijah looked up at his father's face, reading the grief there with a child's intuitive understanding. "Is that why you're sad? Because you miss her?" Marcus wanted to lie. He wanted to protect his son from the weight he carried, the guilt, the helplessness, the memory of watching someone die while being completely powerless to stop it. But Elijah deserved better than lies. "I didn't know her very well," he said finally. "But I was there when she died. And I couldn't save her. And sometimes, buddy, that's the hardest thing in the world. Trying your best and still not being enough." Elijah was quiet for a long moment. Then he wrapped his small arms around his father's waist and squeezed tight. "You're always enough for me, Dad." Marcus pulled his son close and held on, the photograph still pressed between his fingers. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the apartment windows. Across the hall, Lena was probably waiting for a response that might never come. But for the first time in 2 years, Marcus was beginning to think that maybe running wasn't the answer. Maybe it never had been. 3 days passed after Marcus read the letter. 3 days of silence, of avoiding Lena even more deliberately than before, of mapping new routes through the building he'd never used. He started timing his departures to the minute, tracking when Lena typically left for work so he could slip out 15 minutes earlier. The service elevator became his primary exit, the back stairwell his backup plan. He moved through the building like a fugitive, always checking corners, always listening for footsteps, always ready to reverse course if he heard her voice or caught sight of her dark hair in a hallway or stairwell. Dwight noticed at work. "You look like hell, Marcus." They were restocking the ambulance after a call, organizing supplies with the methodical precision that became second nature after enough shifts. Marcus didn't look up from the medical kit he was inventorying. "Didn't sleep well." "You haven't slept well in 3 months." Dwight closed the supply cabinet and turned to face him directly. "What's going on? And don't tell me it's nothing. I've been doing this job long enough to know when my partner's got something eating at him." Marcus set down the medical kit. His hands were steady, a lifetime of emergency training keeping them that way, even when his mind was anything but calm. "There's a woman. She lives across the hall from me." "Okay. She looks exactly like someone I couldn't save 2 years ago." Dwight was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, "The woman from the car accident? October 2 years back?" Marcus nodded. He told Dwight about that night eventually, not the details, not the way Rachel's hand had felt in his, not the words she'd spoken about her sister, but enough. Enough that Dwight knew it had been bad, that it had stuck with Marcus in a way most calls didn't. "The woman across the hall is her sister." Marcus leaned against the ambulance, feeling the weight of 3 sleepless nights pressing down on him. "She's been looking for me for 2 years. She moved into my building to find me." "Jesus," Dwight exhaled slowly. "What does she want?" "To know what her sister said before she died. To know if she was scared. To know if she was alone." And you haven't told her? It wasn't a question. Marcus shook his head anyway. Why not? Because every time I look at her face, I see Rachel dying. I see the moment I failed. I see everything I couldn't fix. Marcus's voice was rough, the words scraping their way out. And I can't do it. I can't stand there and tell her that her sister spent 11 minutes bleeding out while I held her hand and promised help was coming, when I knew she wasn't going to make it. Dwight didn't respond immediately. He finished securing the supply cabinet, checked the ambulance's fuel gauge, did all the small tasks that filled the spaces between calls. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. You're going to have to face this eventually, Marcus. Running only works until it doesn't. That night, Marcus stood outside Lena's apartment for almost 10 minutes before he finally knocked. His heart hammered against his ribs. His palms were slick with sweat. He'd rehearsed what he wanted to say a dozen times on the drive home, but now every word had evaporated from his mind. The door opened. Lena stood there in a simple gray sweater and jeans, her dark hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She looked surprised to see him, then cautious, then something softer that he couldn't quite name. His voice came out steadier than he felt. Can I come in? She stepped aside without a word. He entered her apartment for the first time. It was smaller than his, decorated simply but with a precision that spoke to deliberate choices rather than temporary living. A few plants on the windowsill, healthy and well-tended. A bookshelf overflowing with paperbacks, mostly thrillers and literary fiction. And on the wall beside the couch, a framed photograph of 2 young women at a graduation ceremony. The same photograph she'd included in her letter. Marcus stood in front of it, unable to look away. Rachel's smile seemed to reach through the glass, through time itself, pulling him back to that rain-soaked night when he'd watched that same smile fade into nothing. Lena's voice came from behind him, soft and careful. That was the day she got her nursing degree. She'd just turned 30. She was so proud. She kept saying she was finally going to help people the way she always wanted to. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. A woman who wanted to save lives, killed by a driver who ran a red light. He closed his eyes. Why did you really come here, Lena? Why did you spend 2 years looking for me? She sat down on the couch and folded her hands in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but he could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. Because I needed to know she wasn't alone. The police report said you were with her. The hospital record said you held her hand, but none of that tells me what mattered. She looked up at him, her eyes glistening. Was she scared? Did she suffer? Did she know that someone cared? Marcus turned away from the photograph and sat down in the chair across from her. The distance between them felt both too far and too close. Outside, Denver traffic hummed through the windows, the city moving forward the way it always did, indifferent to individual grief. She was scared at first, he said finally. When I got to her, she was crying. The pain was bad. I could see it in her face. But I talked to her. I told her help was coming, that she just needed to hold on a little longer. Lena pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling over her cheeks. Marcus continued, his voice rough with the effort of remembering. She asked me about my job. She wanted to know how I got into emergency medicine. I told her about my son, about how being a father made me want to do something that mattered. She liked that. She said she understood. He stopped, gathering himself. The memories were rushing back now, vivid and sharp. the way they always did when he let his guard down. Rain on the windshield, blood on his hands, the smell of gasoline, and the sound of metal groaning as the firefighters worked to cut her free. And then she talked about you. Lena's breath caught. Me? She said she had a little sister who was graduating from college that spring. She was so proud of you. She kept saying she was sorry she was going to miss it. Marcus's voice broke on the last word. She maybe promised to tell you something, but I never did. I couldn't find you, and then I tried to forget because remembering hurt too much. What did she say? Lena whispered. Marcus looked at her directly for the first time since entering the apartment. She said, "Tell my sister I'm sorry I couldn't make it to our graduation. Tell her she was always the brave one, not me." The sound that came from Lena was somewhere between a sob and a gasp. She covered her face with both hands, her shoulders shaking. Marcus wanted to reach out to her, to offer some kind of comfort, but he didn't know how. He'd spent so long avoiding this moment that he'd never considered what would happen when it finally arrived. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sound was Lena's quiet crying and the distant hum of traffic outside the window. A siren wailed somewhere in the city, another emergency, another call. The endless cycle of crisis and response that Marcus had built his life around. Finally, Lena lowered her hands and looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. "Thank you. Thank you for staying with her, for holding her hand, for making sure she wasn't alone." Marcus shook his head. "I didn't do anything. I couldn't save her." "You did everything." Lena's voice was fierce now, cutting through his self-doubt like a blade. "You gave her 11 minutes of human connection when she needed it most. You made sure her last moments weren't spent in terror and isolation. That matters, Marcus. That matters more than you know." He wanted to believe her. God, how he wanted to believe her. But the guilt was a weight he'd carried for so long that he didn't know how to put it down. They talked until 3 in the morning, not just about Rachel, but about everything. Lena told him about growing up in Albuquerque, about how Rachel had practically raised her after their mother left when Lena was 12, about working 2 jobs to put herself through college for graphic design, about building a freelance career that now brought in enough money to live comfortably, but left her feeling isolated and disconnected from the world. Marcus told her about Emily, about watching his wife die from stage 4 breast cancer when Elijah was only 2 years old, about 6 years of single fatherhood, of learning to braid hair from YouTube videos and reading parenting books at 2 in the morning when Elijah woke up with nightmares, about the terror and joy of watching his son grow up, of being the only parent that mattered. They discovered they both hated cilantro. Both loved terrible action movies, the kind with impossible stunts and dialogue that made them laugh. Both had lost people too young and carried the weight of survivor's guilt like a second skeleton beneath their skin. When Marcus finally left, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. He stood in Lena's doorway, reluctant to go, feeling like something fundamental had shifted between them. "Thank you," he said, "for finding me, for not giving up." Lena smiled, and for the first time, Marcus could see her face without seeing her sister's ghost behind it. She was Lena, just Lena, and that was more than enough. "Thank you for staying," she replied. Marcus walked across the hall to his own apartment. Inside, Elijah was still sleeping, curled around his Spider-Man plush toy, breathing deeply and peacefully. Marcus stood in the doorway of his son's room and watched him for a long moment, feeling something loosen in his chest. He'd kept Rachel's promise. He'd told Lena what her sister had wanted her to know, and somehow, in the telling, he'd found something he hadn't expected. a way forward. The next 2 weeks passed in a careful dance of proximity and distance. Marcus stopped taking the service elevator, but he still timed his departures to avoid running into Lena in the hallway. They'd exchange nods when they passed, brief acknowledgments that carried the weight of that 3-hour conversation, without requiring either of them to articulate what it meant. Elijah noticed the change immediately. "You said hi to Miss Lena today," he observed one evening while they ate dinner at the small kitchen table. "You never say hi to Miss Lena." Marcus speared a piece of chicken with his fork. "I'm trying to be more neighborly." "What's neighborly mean?" "It means being nice to the people who live near you." Elijah considered this while chewing a mouthful of rice. "Can she come over for dinner sometime? She always looks lonely." Marcus set down his fork. "What makes you think she's lonely?" "She never has visitors, and sometimes I see her sitting on her balcony by herself, just staring at the sky." The boy shrugged, unconcerned by the weight of his observation. "That's what lonely people do in movies." The observation hit Marcus harder than he'd expected. He'd been so focused on his own pain, his own avoidance, that he hadn't considered what Lena's life might look like from the outside. She'd lost her sister. She'd spent 2 years searching for answers, and now she was living alone in an apartment across from a man who'd spent 3 months treating her like a ghost. "Maybe someday, buddy. We'll see." But fate, as it often did, had other plans. It happened on a Saturday afternoon. Marcus was on the balcony reading while Elijah played video games inside. The November air was crisp, the sky that particular shade of blue that only appeared in Colorado, sharp and clear and infinite. Lena was on her own balcony 1 unit over, watering her plants with the careful attention of someone who needed things to take care of. They'd exchanged brief waves earlier, nothing more. Then Elijah appeared at the balcony door, his face troubled in a way that immediately set off every parental alarm Marcus had developed over 8 years. "Dad? Who's Rachel?" Marcus's blood went cold. "What?" "I heard you talking to Miss Lena the other night. Through the wall." Elijah's brow furrowed with concern. "You said Rachel's name a lot, and Miss Lena was crying. Did someone die? Is that why you're always sad?" Marcus set down his book slowly, his mind racing. He'd thought Elijah was asleep during that conversation. He'd thought the walls were thick enough to muffle their voices. He'd been wrong on both counts. "Come here, buddy." Elijah walked over and sat down next to his father, his eyes wide and searching, the way they always were when he sensed something important was happening. Marcus took a breath. "Rachel was Miss Lena's sister. She died 2 years ago in a car accident. I was the person who tried to help her." "You mean like when you help people at work?" "Exactly like that. Sometimes I can help them and sometimes I can't." Marcus looked at his son, at the intelligence and compassion already forming in those 8-year-old eyes. "Rachel was someone I couldn't help, and that's been very hard for me. It's been hard for Miss Lena, too." Elijah was quiet for a moment, processing. Then he asked the question Marcus had been dreading. "Did you hurt her? Is that why you feel bad?" "No, buddy. I didn't hurt her. I tried to save her. I did everything I could. But sometimes our best isn't enough. Sometimes people die even when we do everything right." "That's not fair." "No," Marcus agreed. "It's not fair. But that's how life works sometimes." Elijah leaned against his father's shoulder, the same way he'd done in the hallway weeks ago when Marcus had been sitting on the floor with Lena's letter. The boy's weight was small and solid, an anchor to the present moment when the past threatened to pull Marcus under. "Is that why you've been avoiding Miss Lena? Because seeing her makes you think about Rachel?" The boy's perception was almost frightening. Marcus nodded slowly. She looks just like her sister. When I see Lena's face, I see Rachel's face. And I remember that night, and I remember failing, and it hurts." "But you didn't fail, Dad." Elijah looked up at him with absolute certainty. "You tried. That's what matters. You always tell me that trying is what counts, even if you lose." Marcus pulled his son close, fighting back tears. This 8-year-old boy with his Spider-Man pajamas and his simple, unshakable faith understood something that Marcus had been struggling to grasp for 2 years. Trying was what counted, even if you lost. But understanding it and believing it were two different things. That night, alone in his bedroom while Elijah slept, Marcus made a decision that felt like the only option left. He started packing boxes. The Phoenix Fire Department had approved his transfer request 6 weeks ago. Station 12, better pay, closer to his younger brother Kyle, who could help with Elijah when shifts ran long. The email sat in his inbox like an escape hatch, and Marcus had been staring at it every night since Lena had taped that letter to his door. He couldn't stay here. Every time he saw Lena, every time he heard her voice through the wall, every time Elijah asked another innocent question that ripped open old wounds, the pain grew worse. He'd thought facing the truth would bring closure. Instead, it had only reminded him of everything he'd lost, everything he couldn't fix, every moment he'd failed when it mattered most. Marcus pulled clothes from his closet and folded them into cardboard boxes from the storage unit downstairs. Elijah's toys went into smaller containers. Books got stacked by the door. The apartment began to look temporary again, the way it had 6 years ago when he'd first moved in after Emily died, before he'd made it into something that felt like home. The lease in Phoenix was already signed, 2-bedroom apartment in Tempe, 15 minutes from Kyle's house, $1,800 a month with a $3,600 deposit already paid. Mesa Elementary had a spot for Elijah starting the first week of December, 2 weeks away. 14 days to pack up their lives and disappear before Lena realized what was happening. Marcus worked until 3 in the morning, moving quietly so Elijah wouldn't wake up and ask questions he couldn't answer. When he finally collapsed into bed, sleep came fitfully, broken by dreams of rain and crushed metal, and a woman's hand going slack in his. The next morning, he told Lena. They stood in the hallway, Marcus with his hands shoved deep in his pockets, Lena with confusion written across her face in sharp, clear lines. Her voice came out careful, controlled. "You're leaving?" "I have to. For Elijah's sake. For my own sake." He couldn't meet her eyes. "Every time I see you, I see her. And every time Elijah sees me falling apart, I'm failing him as a father." "Marcus, running away isn't going to fix anything." "Maybe not. But staying is killing me." Mina's expression shifted from confusion to something harder, something that looked almost like anger. Her jaw set in a way that reminded him of Rachel, of the fierce determination he'd seen in those final minutes when she'd fought to stay conscious, to keep talking, to hold on just a little longer. "You're not running from me," she said quietly. "You're running from yourself. And you can move to the other side of the country, but that won't change anything. You'll still carry her with you. You'll still blame yourself for something that wasn't your fault." Marcus finally looked at her. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her posture was rigid, unyielding. "I watched my sister die without being there," Lena continued, her voice gaining strength. "I spent 2 years haunted by questions I couldn't answer. And then I found you, and I finally got some peace. But you're still trapped in that car with her, aren't you? You never left. The words hit him like a physical blow, because she was right. 2 years later, and he was still holding Rachel's hand in that crushed vehicle, still watching the light fade from her eyes, still whispering promises he couldn't keep about help arriving and everything being okay, when nothing was okay. Nothing would ever be okay again. I don't know how to let go. Maybe you don't have to let go. Mina reached out and touched his arm, the first physical contact they'd shared beyond that initial moment in the stairwell 3 months ago. Her hand was warm, gentle, nothing like the cold grip of a dying woman. Maybe you just have to stop carrying it alone. Her fingers rested on his forearm, light enough that he could pull away if he wanted to. He didn't. Don't leave, she said. Not like this. Not because you're scared. Marcus looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face, so much like Rachel's, and yet so completely her own. The morning sun cut through the hallway window, catching the dust motes suspended in air, making everything feel fragile and temporary. He didn't answer. But that night, after Elijah had gone to bed, Marcus unpacked the boxes. The unpacked boxes sat in the corner of the living room for 3 days, a monument to indecision. Marcus walked past them every morning, every evening, a reminder of the choice he'd almost made and the one he was still trying to understand. Elijah found him staring at them on the 4th night, standing in the middle of the living room with his arms crossed, looking at cardboard containers like they held answers instead of clothes and books and the detritus of a life that had never quite felt settled. Dad? Are we still moving? Marcus turned. His son stood in the doorway wearing those same Spider-Man pajamas, his face creased with worry. The boy had been quieter than usual all week, tiptoeing around the apartment like he was afraid of disturbing something fragile, something that might shatter if he made too much noise. No, buddy. We're not moving. Promise? The word hung in the air between them. Marcus thought about all the promises he'd made in his life, the ones he'd kept, and the ones he'd broken. He thought about the promise he'd made to Rachel, the one about telling Lena she was the brave one. It had taken him 2 years to keep that promise, but he'd kept it. Promise. Elijah's face relaxed into relief, the tension draining from his small shoulders. He crossed the room and climbed onto the couch next to his father, tucking himself under Marcus's arm with the ease of long practice. Dad, can I ask you something? Always. You said trying is what counts, even if you lose. But what happens when you're too scared to try? Marcus looked down at his son, surprised by the question. What do you mean? Like with Miss Lena. You were scared to talk to her, right? Because of Rachel. But then you did it anyway, and now you're not as sad anymore. Elijah tilted his head, thinking. So maybe being scared is okay, as long as you still try. The simplicity of it struck Marcus like sunlight breaking through clouds. His 8-year-old son, with his video games and his endless questions, had just summarized 2 years of struggle in a single sentence. Being scared is okay, as long as you still try. When did you get so smart? Elijah grinned. I learned from you. Also from cartoons. They have good lessons sometimes. Marcus laughed, the sound surprising him. It had been a long time since he'd laughed like that, without reservation, without the weight of grief pressing down on his chest. You're right. Being scared is okay. And I think I've been scared for too long. The next evening, Marcus knocked on Lena's door again. This time, his hands weren't shaking. This time, he knew exactly what he wanted to say. She opened the door with a cautious expression that softened when she saw his face. Something had changed in him, and she could tell. "Can I come in?" She stepped aside. He entered for the second time, and the apartment felt different now, less like foreign territory and more like a space that might become familiar. "I've been thinking about what you said, about carrying things alone, about not letting go, but not running either." Lena sat down on the couch, watching him with those dark eyes that were so like her sister's and yet entirely her own. The late November light came through her windows at an angle, casting long shadows across the floor. Marcus remained standing, needing the movement, the ability to pace if his words failed him. "I've saved 47 people in my career. 47 lives that might have ended without me. But I don't remember most of them. I don't remember their faces, their names, their stories. The ones I remember are the ones I lost." He moved to sit in the chair across from her, the same chair he'd occupied weeks ago when he'd first told her about Rachel's final moments. The cushion had a familiar depression now, shaped by his weight. "Your sister was the first person who died while I was holding their hand. Not the first I lost on a call, but the first where I was right there, looking into their eyes, watching the light go out. And I couldn't let go. Not of her hand, not of that night, not of the feeling that I should have done more." Lena's eyes glistened, but she didn't interrupt. "I told Elijah about it, about Rachel, about what happened." Marcus's voice cracked slightly. "He asked me if I'd hurt her, and I told him no. I told him I'd tried my best, and he said that's what matters. Trying." He paused, gathering himself. "An 8-year-old understood something that took me 2 years to figure out." "What's that?" "That failing doesn't mean I didn't matter. That being there, even when I couldn't change the outcome, was still something. Rachel wasn't alone because of me. She knew someone cared because of me. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any of us can do." Lena reached out and took his hand, the same way she'd touched his arm in the hallway days before. But this time, Marcus didn't pull away. Her fingers were warm, her grip firm, and for the first time in 2 years, touch didn't feel like an accusation. "It's more than enough. It's everything." They talked for hours that night, not about Rachel, not about grief, but about their lives. Lena told him about her graphic design work, about landing her first Fortune 500 client 3 years ago, about building a business that brought in enough money to live comfortably, but left her working alone in her apartment 16 hours a day, about the success that felt hollow when there was no one to share it with. Marcus told her about the realities of single fatherhood, about parent-teacher conferences where he was the only father in a room full of mothers, about learning to cook from YouTube videos because Emily had been the one who knew how to make more than boxed macaroni and grilled cheese, about the terror of raising a boy alone, of knowing he was the only person standing between Elijah and a world that could be cruel and unforgiving. They discovered they both loved terrible action movies, the kind where cars exploded for no reason and the hero survived falls that should have killed them instantly. They both hated cilantro with a passion that bordered on irrational. They both knew what it felt like to be the person left behind, to carry guilt that had no logical foundation but felt real enough to suffocate. By the time Marcus left, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. He stood in her doorway, reluctant to go, feeling like something fundamental had shifted between them in ways he couldn't quite articulate. "Thank you for finding me, for not giving up." Lena smiled, and Marcus could see her face without seeing her sister's ghost behind it. She was Lena, just Lena, with her own life and her own pain and her own reasons for being here. "Thank you for staying." The weeks that followed developed their own rhythm. Marcus stopped timing his departures to avoid Lena. They'd run into each other in the hallway, exchange more than just nods, Sometimes they'd talk for a few minutes about nothing important, the kind of casual conversation that neighbors had when they were becoming something more than strangers sharing a floor. Elijah noticed everything, the way children always did. "You're friends with Miss Lena now." They were eating breakfast before school, Elijah working his way through a bowl of cereal while Marcus drank coffee and tried to wake up enough to function. "We're getting to know each other." "That's good. She needs friends. She works too much." Marcus looked at his son over the rim of his coffee mug. "How do you know she works too much?" "Because her light's always on when I go to bed, and it's still on when I wake up sometimes." Elijah shrugged, unbothered by his surveillance. "And she orders a lot of food delivery. I see the delivery people in the hallway all the time." The observation painted a picture Marcus hadn't fully considered. Lena, with her successful career and her nice apartment and her complete isolation from anything resembling a normal social life. Working 16-hour days because work was easier than facing the empty space her sister had left behind. "Maybe we should invite her over for dinner sometime." Elijah's face lit up. "Really? Can I help cook?" "Sure, buddy, but that means you have to eat vegetables." The boy's enthusiasm dimmed slightly, but didn't disappear. "Okay, but not broccoli." Marcus texted Lena that afternoon during his lunch break at the station. The message felt awkward, too formal for what they'd become, but too casual for what they weren't quite ready to acknowledge. "Elijah wants to know if you'd like to come over for dinner Saturday. Fair warning, he's helping cook, so the kitchen might be a disaster." Her response came back 15 minutes later. "I'd love to. What can I bring?" "Just yourself, and low expectations for the food." "Perfect. I'll bring wine anyway." Saturday arrived with the kind of crisp December weather that made Denver feel impossibly clean, the air sharp enough to hurt your lungs if you breathed too deep. Marcus and Elijah spent the afternoon attempting to make lasagna from a recipe Marcus's mother had sent him years ago, a piece of paper stained with tomato sauce and folded so many times the creases had started to tear. Elijah stood on the step stool at the counter, carefully layering noodles and ricotta cheese with the concentration of a surgeon. Flour dusted his hair. Tomato sauce had somehow gotten on his shirt despite the apron Marcus had tied around him. "Are we making this right, Dad?" Marcus looked at the recipe, then at the pan. "Close enough. Cooking's more art than science anyway." "That's not what you said when I mixed up the salt and sugar last month." "That was baking. Baking is science. Cooking is art." "What's the difference?" "In baking, you have to follow the recipe exactly, or everything fails. In cooking, you can improvise, and usually it works out okay." Elijah considered this while spreading another layer of sauce. "What about life? Is that science or art?" The question stopped Marcus mid-motion, his hand frozen over the mozzarella cheese. His 8-year-old son, covered in flour and tomato sauce, had just asked something that felt too big for a Saturday afternoon in a kitchen that smelled like garlic and basil. "I think it's both. You need some structure, some rules to follow, but you also need room to improvise when things don't go according to plan." "Like how we were going to move to Phoenix, but then we didn't?" "Exactly like that." Lena arrived at 6:30 with a bottle of wine and a bouquet of flowers that she handed to Elijah with a seriousness that made the boy beam. "For the chef." "I'm not the chef. Dad is. I'm the sous chef." "Do you know what that means?" "Not really, but it sounds important." Lena laughed, and the sound filled the apartment with a warmth Marcus hadn't realized was missing. She followed them into the kitchen, took in the disaster of flour and sauce and abandoned utensils, and didn't even blink. "This looks perfect." "It looks like a tornado hit," Marcus said, trying to wipe sauce off the counter and only succeeding in spreading it further. "I said what I said." Dinner was chaotic in the best possible way. The lasagna was slightly overcooked on the edges and undercooked in the middle, but no one cared. Elijah talked non-stop about school and his friends and the science project he was working on about volcanoes. Lena asked questions like she was genuinely interested, not just being polite, and Elijah responded with the kind of enthusiasm he usually reserved for video games and superhero movies. Marcus watched them interact and felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of tension he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. After dinner, while Elijah was occupied with a video game in his room, Marcus and Lena sat on the balcony with the wine she'd brought. The December night was cold but not unbearable, the kind of temperature that required jackets but didn't drive you inside immediately. "He's a great kid." "He is. Better than I deserve most days." Lena looked at him over the rim of her wine glass. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Diminish yourself. You're a single father working a demanding job and raising a compassionate, intelligent child. That's not luck. That's hard work." Marcus stared at the lights of Denver spreading out below them, the city alive and indifferent to individual struggles. "I feel like I'm barely holding it together most of the time. Like one wrong move and everything falls apart." "That's called being human." Lena's voice was gentle but firm. "Rachel felt that way too. She'd call me at 2 a.m, panicking about whether she was good enough to be a nurse, whether she'd made the right choice, whether she was helping anyone or just going through motions." She paused, her breath visible in the cold air. "I think we all feel like we're one step away from disaster. The difference is, some of us admit it." "Rachel called you at 2 a.m? "All the time. She was an insomniac. Anxiety, mostly. She'd worry about patients, about making mistakes, about all the things that could go wrong." Lena smiled at the memory. "I used to tell her that caring that much meant she was doing it right, that indifference was the real failure, not fear." Marcus turned that over in his mind, testing it against his own experience. "I've been afraid of failing for so long that I forgot there's a difference between healthy fear and paralysis." "What changed?" "Elijah asked me what happens when you're too scared to try, and I realized I'd been teaching him the opposite of what I believed. That trying mattered, that effort counted even when outcomes didn't go your way." He looked at her directly. "And then I realized staying in Denver, unpacking those boxes, knocking on your door, all of that was me trying. Scared, but trying." Lena reached over and took his hand. It felt natural now, easy, like something they'd been doing for years instead of weeks. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you stayed." "Me too." They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching the city lights flicker and shift as people moved through their Saturday nights, each with their own struggles and joys and moments of grace. Inside, Elijah called out, "Dad! Miss Lena! Come look at my volcano!" They stood together, still holding hands, and went inside to admire a baking soda and vinegar creation that was threatening to overflow onto Elijah's bedroom carpet. It was messy and chaotic and perfect. Exactly the kind of moment Marcus had been too afraid to hope for. The weeks before Christmas passed in a blur of work shifts and school events and increasingly frequent dinners at Marcus's apartment. Lena became a fixture, arriving with wine or dessert, or sometimes just herself, fitting into the space between Marcus and Elijah like she'd always been meant to be there. She taught Elijah how to use Adobe Illustrator to design Christmas cards. Marcus taught her how to make his mother's chicken soup when she mentioned she'd been fighting a cold. Elijah taught both of them how to play his favorite video game, a cooperative adventure that required communication and teamwork, and they were terrible at it, but laughed anyway. On the surface, nothing had been formally defined. They weren't dating exactly. They were neighbors who'd become friends, who were becoming something more, undefined and unlabeled, and somehow right because of it. But underneath, Marcus could feel the shift happening. The way his day felt incomplete if he didn't see Lena at least once. The way Elijah automatically set 3 places at the table instead of 2. The way coming home felt different, warmer, like the apartment had expanded to accommodate more than just survival. Dwight noticed at work. "You seem different." They were between calls, parked at a convenience store while Dwight grabbed coffee and Marcus checked their equipment levels. The observation came out casual, but Dwight's eyes were sharp with the kind of attention that came from 20 years of reading people in crisis. "Different how?" "Less tense, like you finally figured out how to breathe again." Marcus closed the equipment bay and leaned against the ambulance. The December afternoon was cold, the sun already low in the sky even though it was barely past 3. In a few hours, he'd go home to Elijah and probably Lena, and they'd eat dinner together and talk about nothing important and everything that mattered. "I took your advice about facing things instead of running." "The woman across the hall?" "Yeah. Turns out talking about it helped. Who knew?" Dwight grinned. "Literally everyone who's ever been to therapy." "I don't go to therapy." "Maybe you should." Marcus considered that. He'd spent 2 years carrying Rachel's death alone, letting it fester and grow until it consumed everything else. And then Lena had shown up, and Elijah had asked difficult questions, and somehow between the two of them, he'd been forced to confront what he'd been running from. "Maybe I will." That night, after Elijah had gone to bed and Lena had gone back to her own apartment, Marcus sat on the couch and pulled out his phone. He'd been avoiding it all day, the email that had arrived that morning, but now, in the quiet darkness, he opened it. From Phoenix Fire Department. Subject: Transfer status. Action required. Marcus, we need confirmation by December 31st regarding your transfer to Station 12. The position has been held for you, but we have other candidates if you've decided not to accept. Please advise. Marcus stared at the email for a long time. The cursor blinked in the reply field, waiting for his decision. Phoenix meant better pay, a fresh start, proximity to Kyle, and support with Elijah. It meant leaving behind the apartment where Emily had died, the hallways where he'd spent 3 months avoiding Lena, the weight of Denver and everything it represented. It also meant leaving Lena, leaving whatever was developing between them, fragile and new and undefined, leaving Elijah's school and his friends and the stability the boy had finally found after years of upheaval. Marcus's fingers hovered over the keyboard. He could type a quick confirmation, pack up the boxes again, be in Phoenix before New Year's. Clean break, fresh start. All the cliches people used when they were running from something they didn't want to name. Or he could stay. Could see where this went with Lena. Could give Elijah the stability of staying in one place. Could stop running and start building something that felt like a future instead of just survival. He typed a response. "I appreciate the opportunity, but I've decided to remain in Denver. Thank you for holding the position." His finger paused over the send button. This was it. The moment that determined whether he kept running or finally stood still. He pressed send. The email whooshed away into the digital void, taking the escape hatch with it. Marcus set down his phone and sat in the darkness of his apartment, feeling the weight of the decision settle over him like a blanket, heavy but not suffocating. He'd stayed. He'd chosen to stay. For a